Welcome to AI 103 Practice Exam, Integrated Apps and Agent Scenarios. This set contains 50 original questions across the 5 exam domains. Use each question to practice the mechanism and service boundaries you will need on exam day. Here is how this practice exam works. First, read the complete scenario and every response. Next, lock in your answer. You will have 3 silent seconds to commit, and you can pause the video whenever you need more thinking time. Then I will reveal the correct response. Finally, I will explain why it works and reinforce the exam pattern. If this practice helps, like the video and subscribe to WebLizard CertLab for the next AI 103 set. Case study. Contoso is building a Microsoft Foundry customer support solution. 2 development teams work on different use cases and require distinct access controls while sharing centralized network security, model deployments, and Azure tool integrations. The solution references separately provisioned Azure storage and Azure AI Search resources. Customer requests can include unstructured text and product images. The text path must evaluate Azure AI content safety harm categories and block list hits. The image path uses a vision-enabled Azure OpenAI chat deployment. Architecture staff must preserve product-specific credentials, API contracts, lifecycle states, and regional constraints. Keep this shared context in mind for the next question. Question 1. For the customer support solution in the shared case scenario, which 2 architecture decisions meet the team isolation and connected resource governance requirements? Select exactly 2 answers. A. Convert the connected Azure storage and Azure AI Search resources into project assets so that project access controls govern them. B. Manage networking, access policies, and compliance settings separately on the connected Azure storage and Azure AI Search resources. C. Create a separate project for each team under the same Foundry resource and assign access controls at the project level, while the projects reuse parent settings. D. Create a separate top-level Foundry resource for each team, solely because the teams need distinct access controls. E. Plan every required API exclusively at project scope, because all Foundry APIs are project scoped. F. Rely on each Foundry connection to transfer the Foundry resource network and compliance controls to the connected Azure resource. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Manage networking, access policies, and compliance settings separately on the connected Azure storage and Azure AI Search resources. C. Create a separate project for each team under the same Foundry resource and assign access controls at the project level while the projects reuse parent settings. Why this works. Multiple projects on one Foundry resource can have distinct access controls while sharing parent resource settings. Connected Azure resources remain independent resources with their own governance boundaries, so their networking, access, and compliance controls are managed separately. Exam pattern. Choose the Foundry hierarchy and governance boundaries for multiple teams and connected Azure services. Question 2. A release team uses the following orchestration for change summaries. Assume the checker rejects all 3 drafts. What behavior does the snippet implement? Visible artifact. An initial draft is created by a maker from the request. A loop runs for 3 iterations. On each iteration, a checker compares the current draft with the acceptance criteria and returns a verdict. If the verdict passes, the current draft is sent to publish and the process ends. When a verdict fails during either of the first 2 iterations, the maker receives the original request, the previous draft, and the checker feedback to create a revision. After the 3rd failed iteration, the current draft and the latest verdict notes are sent to a human review queue. A. It sends every checker failure directly to a human and never asks the maker to revise. B. It can refine forever because the loop has no explicit variable increment. C. It publishes the 3rd rejected draft automatically when the loop ends. D. It performs at most 3 criteria-based checks, feeds each of the first 2 failures into a revision, and escalates the last rejected draft after the 3rd failure. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. It performs at most 3 criteria-based checks, feeds each of the first 2 failures into a revision, and escalates the last rejected draft after the 3rd failure. Why this works? The finite range permits 3 checks. The first 2 failures drive revisions. A pass publishes. The 3rd failure routes the last checked draft and feedback to the human queue. Exam pattern: trace feedback, pass, cap, and fallback. Question 3. A document operations team needs an analyzer for stable multimodal extraction in a production service. The team also wants an interface optimized for improving analyzer performance with labeled examples. Complex reasoning over document evidence is outside scope. Which configuration should the architect specify? A. Use Content Understanding Studio with API version 2026-06-01 preview for the production analyzer. B. Use the Foundry portal with agentic mode and API version 2026-06-01 preview for the analyzer. C. Use Content Understanding Studio with API version 2025-11-01 for the production analyzer. D. Use Content Understanding Studio with agentic mode and API version 2025-11-01 for the analyzer. E. Use the Foundry portal with agentic mode while keeping API version 2025-11-01 for the analyzer. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Use Content Understanding Studio with API version 2025-11-01 for the production analyzer. Why this works? Use Content Understanding Studio for the analyzer improvement workflow and API version 2025-11-01 for production. The 2026-06-01 preview version is for evaluating preview capabilities, and agentic document understanding is available only through that preview path. Exam pattern: select the current production surface and API version for a non-agentic analyzer improvement workload. Question 4. A developer is preparing a Sora 2 preview create video request on the Azure OpenAI V1 API. The request should use one PNG reference image as the visual anchor. Which correction is required before the job is created? Visible artifact. The request selects the Sora 2 model and uses a prompt describing a slow camera orbit around the product on a studio table. The requested output size is 1280 by 720. It includes one input reference file named product reference in portable network graphics format. The reference image has dimensions of 720 by 1280. A. Remove job status handling because create video returns the completed MP4 synchronously. B. Add a second PNG reference image because Sora 2 requires 2 visual anchors. C. Resize the reference image to 1280 by 720 so it exactly matches the requested output size. D. Replace Sora 2 with a GPT image deployment and keep the video request shape. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Resize the reference image to 1280 by 720 so it exactly matches the requested output size. Why this works? Sora 2 Preview accepts a single JPEG, PNG, or WebP reference image, and that image must exactly match the requested output size. Here, the output is 1280 by 720, while the reference is 720 by 1280. The Azure OpenAI V1 flow is asynchronous. Create a job, check status, and download the finished video. Exam pattern: correct a Sora 2 reference media request whose input image dimensions do not match output dimensions. Question 5. A marketplace accepts product images without accompanying text. The application must classify each image for hate, self-harm, sexual, and violence, receive severity levels, and then apply its own blocking policy. Which implementation should you use? A. Call the Preview Multimodal API with empty associated text and assume it uses the Image Analyze Request contract. B. Train custom categories standard on the images and use its classifier output as the severity result. C. Call Image Analyze with API version 2024-09-01, provide base64 content or a blob URL, and request 4 severity levels. D. Train custom categories rapid and treat every non-zero category result as an automatic service-side block. Lock in your answer. Correct response. C. Call Image Analyze with API version 2024-09-01. Provide base64 content or a blob URL and request 4 severity levels. Why this works. The GA Image Analyze API version 2024-09-01 accepts image content as base64 or a blob URL and can analyze all 4 named harm categories with 4 severity levels. Classification supplies category and severity information. The application still implements enforcement policy. Exam pattern. Select the correct Visual Content Classification API and preserve the classification versus enforcement boundary. Question 6. A team proposes the following configuration for a new, long-lived production orchestrator. The solution must run as a Foundry-managed hosted agent and use Foundry-exclusive platform tools. Which implementation meets the requirements? Visible artifact. The deployment intent is a new, long-lived production deployment. The agent type is hosted agent. The orchestration surface is the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer. The application programming interface endpoint scope is resource level OpenAI. Replace the Visual Designer with Microsoft Agent Framework in a self-hosted process and call the responses API at the Foundry project endpoint. B. Implement orchestration in hosted agent code with Microsoft Agent Framework, but use the resource-level OpenAI endpoint for Foundry-exclusive platform tools. C. Implement orchestration in hosted agent code with Microsoft Agent Framework and use the responses API at the Foundry project endpoint. D. Keep the hosted agent in the Visual Workflow Designer and call the responses API at the Foundry project endpoint. Lock in your answer. Correct response. C. Implement orchestration in hosted agent code with Microsoft Agent Framework and use the responses API at the Foundry project endpoint. Why this works. Hosted agents are not supported in the Visual Workflow Designer. Microsoft Agent Framework is the recommended code orchestration layer for hosted agents, and Foundry-specific agents in platform tools require the Foundry project endpoint. The Visual Designer is public preview and scheduled to retire on December 1st, 2026, so it is not the default for this new, long-lived production design. Exam pattern. Diagnose a hosted agent orchestration configuration that selects both the wrong authoring surface and wrong endpoint scope. Question 7. A contact center team needs one fully managed, low-latency voice agent interface that combines speech recognition, generative AI, and text-to-speech. The agent must call an external order status function. The team has verified regional support and has standardized on GPT-5.4 Mini. Which architecture meets the requirements? A. Use Voice Live with the Preview 5.4 Mini row in every speech region and omit the external function integration. B. Use Voice Live over WebSockets. Select GPT-5.4 Mini as a natively pre-deployed model and configure function calling. C. Use fast transcription for the live stream. Call a separate generative endpoint and synthesize each response with standard text-to-speech. D. Use Voice Live over WebSockets. Deploy GPT-5.4 Mini in a Foundry resource. Connect it through BYOM and configure function calling. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Use Voice Live over WebSockets. Deploy GPT-5.4 Mini in a Foundry resource. Connect it through BYOM and configure function calling. Why this works. Voice Live supplies the managed low-latency interface and supports external actions through function calling. Server-to-server integration uses WebSocket events. GPT 5.4 Mini is not pre-deployed for Voice Live, so it must be deployed in a Foundry resource and connected through BYOM. Exam pattern. Choose a Voice Live deployment path for a named BYOM-only model and external tool invocation. Question 8. A team reviews this Microsoft Foundry observability configuration and dashboard observation. The team needs to interpret the current coverage and diagnose which LLM or tool step drives latency. Which conclusion is correct? Visible artifact. The Foundry portal state is new, and Application Insights is connected. Continuous evaluation has a sample rate of 10% and uses the Violence Evaluator. The dashboard records token usage of 84,210 and a 95th percentile latency of 12,600 milliseconds. A. The dashboard proves every request passed all safety categories and already contains a complete trace for each tool invocation. B. Continuous evaluation is automatically preview because dashboard alerts and scheduled red team scans are marked preview. C. The dashboard covers operational metrics and sampled violence evaluations that use distributed tracing to inspect LLM calls, tools, decisions, and dependencies. D. The latency metric is itself a safety evaluator result, so adding distributed tracing would duplicate the same signal. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. The dashboard covers operational metrics and sampled violence evaluations. Use distributed tracing to inspect LLM calls, tools, decisions, and dependencies. Why this works. The Foundry new portal dashboard metric view is preview and shows operational metrics plus evaluator results from sampled outputs. A 10% sample does not establish safety coverage for every request or every risk category. Distributed tracing is the mechanism for execution flow visibility across LLM calls, tool invocations, agent decisions, and dependencies. Exam pattern. Interpret sampled evaluation coverage and select tracing for step-level latency diagnosis. Question 9. A team is replacing a content understanding integration that used 2025-0501 Preview Pro mode. The replacement must use the current GA API, accept either one URL input or one base64 request body, and wait for asynchronous completion before reading Markdown or fields. Which implementation decisions are required? Select 3 answers. A. Keep Pro mode and declare it inside the 2025-1101 GA Analyzer configuration. B. Poll the operation location URL until the operation status is succeeded. C. When Markdown is requested, parse the HTTP response as raw Markdown rather than structured JSON. D. Use Analyze for URL input and Analyze binary for a base64 request body. E. Submit several files in the GA Analyze inputs array to avoid separate operations. F. Move the analyzer to the 2025-1101 GA API and use Standard rather than Pro mode. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Poll the operation location URL until the operation status is succeeded. D. Use Analyze for URL input and Analyze binary for a base64 request body. F. Move the analyzer to the 2025-1101 GA API and use Standard rather than Pro mode. Why this works. The current Content Understanding API is 2025-1101 GA. Pro mode remained on the retired 2025-0501 preview lineage and is excluded from GA. The GA contract uses Analyze for URL input, Analyze binary for base 64 body input, returns an operation location for polling, and supports one item in the Analyze inputs array. Results remain structured JSON with separate markdown and fields properties. Exam pattern. Migrate an asynchronous content understanding client from retired Pro preview semantics to the current GA input and polling contract. Question 10. A claims platform uses the 2025-1101 GA Content Understanding API. The same document analysis output must provide readable context for an Azure AI Search RAG index and schema-aligned claim fields for an agent that shows reviewers where each value came from. Which design should you implement? A. Route only Markdown to both consumers, discard structured fields, and infer source regions from the generated pros. B. Route Markdown to search and RAG, route schema fields to the agent, and enable estimate field source and confidence for confidence and grounding. C. Route schema fields to search as Markdown, route raw OCR text to the agent, and assume grounding is returned by default. D. Route only JSON fields to both consumers, disable source estimation, and treat each value as grounded without region evidence. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Route Markdown to search and RAG route schema fields to the agent, and enable estimate field source and confidence for confidence and grounding. Why this works. Content Understanding supports clean Markdown for reasoning, search and RAG, and schema-aligned key value fields for agentic applications. Grounding identifies the source content regions for extracted or generated values, and must be enabled with estimate field source and confidence in the 2025-1101 GA API. Exam pattern. Route distinct content understanding representations to both agent and RAG consumers, while enabling source grounding. Question 11. During pre-production testing, a RAG assistant produces polished responses that sometimes do not answer the query, are not supported by retrieved context, and invent customer attributes from prior interactions. Which evaluator set most directly measures all three failures? A. Relevance, standard groundedness, and ungrounded attributes. B. Document retrieval, response completeness, preview, and protected materials. C. Tool call accuracy, task completion, and sensitive data leakage. D. Fluency, coherence, and violence. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Relevance, standard groundedness, and ungrounded attributes. Why this works. Relevance measures fit to the query. Groundedness measures support in retrieved context, and ungrounded attributes detects fabricated or erroneous information inferred from user interactions. Fluency alone would only measure readability and cannot establish support or relevance. Exam pattern. Select evaluators that separately measure query fit, contextual support, and inferred fabrication. Question 12. A production RAG service must measure whether responses are grounded in retrieved context. The product owner requests a binary pass/fail result, no evaluator model deployment, and a production service level agreement. Groundedness Pro provides binary pass/fail without a model deployment, but it is marked preview in the archived evaluator catalog. What should you recommend? A. Use response completeness because it supplies a production-supported binary groundedness result without a deployment. B. Use Groundedness Pro because its binary output and no deployment behavior satisfy all production requirements. C. Use the Responsible AI dashboard because it is a universal explanation surface for arbitrary RAG and agent responses. D. Use the unmarked groundedness evaluator and revise the binary and no deployment constraints to accept its model-based 1 to 5 score. Lock in your answer. Correct response. D. Use the unmarked groundedness evaluator and revise the binary and no deployment constraints to accept its model-based 1 to 5 score. Why this works. The requested combination cannot be met by Groundedness Pro under the held production boundary. It is preview, has no SLA, and is not recommended for production. The unmarked groundedness evaluator measures grounding with a model-based 1 to 5 score, so using it requires revising the binary and no deployment constraints rather than silently treating preview as production supported. Exam pattern. Resolve a production evaluator selection conflict without erasing preview lifecycle constraints. Question 13. An engineer is configuring a Foundry agent that uses the preview low-level memory API for cross-session preferences and a custom function for order status. The current configuration assumes automatic memory scoping and model-side function execution. Which correction is required? Visible artifact. The memory configuration uses the low-level application programming interface and an automatic from-caller scope. The tools list contains one tool whose type is function and whose name is getOrderStatus. Its executor is the model. A. Keep automatic scope resolution and let the model execute the custom function after selecting it. B. Set scope explicitly on each low-level memory request and have the application execute the function and return its result. C. Replace memory with the current conversation and let the model retain preferences across sessions without a managed store. D. Replace the function with file search and store the order system action in uploaded documents for execution. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Set scope explicitly on each low-level memory request and have the application execute the function and return its result. Why this works. Low-level memory API requests require explicit scope. Automatic caller-based scope resolution is limited to the memory search tool with its documented user scope expression. For function calling, the model selects a tool from instructions and definitions, but the application or service executes it and returns a result. Memory remains a preview long-term mechanism, not a synonym for current conversation state. Exam pattern. Correct 2 integration boundary errors in a memory plus function agent configuration. Question 14. A team is designing 3 context sources for a Foundry agent. Learned user preferences that must persist across sessions, a curated organizational policy corpus shared across agents, and documents uploaded by a user for the current interaction. Which 3 selections correctly map the needs while preserving lifecycle boundaries? Select 3 answers. A. Use Foundry agent service memory for learned cross-session preferences and treat memory and memory store API as preview. B. Use Foundry IQ as the long-term store for user preferences learned across sessions because all Foundry IQ features are GA. C. Use file search for user-provided documents that must be searched during the interaction. D. Use a Foundry IQ knowledge base for curated organizational content, preserving its mixed GA and preview status. E. Use Foundry agent service memory as the primary shared store for the curated organizational policy corpus. F. Use file search as the durable cross-session store for learned preferences because uploaded files persist as memory. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Use Foundry agent service memory for learned cross-session preferences and treat memory and memory store API as preview. C. Use file search for user-provided documents that must be searched during the interaction. D. Use a Foundry IQ knowledge base for curated organizational content, preserving its mixed GA and preview status. Why this works. The documented selection boundary is purpose-specific. Learned persistent user or agent context uses Foundry agent service memory. Curated organizational grounding uses Foundry IQ. And interaction-scoped user documents use file search. Memory and Memory Store API are preview. Foundry IQ has mixed GA and preview status, with portal access to all agentic retrieval features preview only in the held snapshot. Exam pattern. Choose memory, organizational knowledge, and interaction document integrations by persistence and content ownership. Question 15. A support team uploads proprietary product manuals for a Foundry agent. The agent must ground answers in those files without calling a custom business function. Which tool should the team add? A. Use conversation memory alone because it automatically indexes newly uploaded manuals. B. Use web search because it is the grounding mechanism for proprietary uploaded files. C. Add file search so the agent can retrieve relevant content from the uploaded manuals by vector search. D. Define a custom lookup function and require the application to execute it for every manual question. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Add file search so the agent can retrieve relevant content from the uploaded manuals by vector search. Why this works. File search augments an agent with knowledge from uploaded or proprietary documents by using vector search. Function calling instead defines custom functions that an application executes, and web search grounds from the public web rather than the uploaded manual set. Exam pattern. Select the agent tool that retrieves grounding content from uploaded proprietary documents. Case study. Contoso is building a Microsoft Foundry customer support solution. Two development teams work on different use cases and require distinct access controls while sharing centralized network security, model deployments, and Azure tool integrations. The solution references separately provisioned Azure storage and Azure AI Search resources. Customer requests can include unstructured text and product images. The text path must evaluate Azure AI content safety harm categories and block list hits. The image path uses a vision-enabled Azure OpenAI chat deployment. Architecture staff must preserve product-specific credentials, API contracts, lifecycle states, and regional constraints. Keep this shared context in mind for the next question. Question 16. For the image path in the shared case scenario, a developer prepares the following vision-enabled chat completions request. The list contains 11 PNG URLs, and every URL is reachable only through a storage private endpoint. Which two input changes are required to bring the request within the documented image input contract? Visible artifact. The image address list takes the first 11 entries from private blob uniform resource locators. The content begins with one text item saying, "Describe the product damage." It then appends one image item for each selected address, using that address as the image locator value. The chat completions create call uses the placeholder model deployment name, one user message whose content is this combined list, and a maximum response of 100 tokens. The returned value is stored as the response. Select exactly two answers. A. Replace each PNG with an animated GIF so that every frame is analyzed. B. Convert the PNG images to PDF before including them in the message content array. C. Remove max tokens so that the service chooses an unlimited response size. D. Provide each image by a publicly accessible HTTP/HTTPS URL or by base64 encoded image data. E. Keep the private URLs and peer the storage VNet with the Azure OpenAI resource VNet. F. Reduce the request to no more than 10 images. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Provide each image by a publicly accessible HTTP/HTTPS URL or by base64 encoded image data. F. Reduce the request to no more than 10 images. Why this works. The held vision chat completions contract permits at most 10 images per request. Image input can use a public HTTP/HTTP SURL or base64 data, but URLs behind private endpoints, VNet restrictions, or firewalls are not supported because the service fetches images from Microsoft-managed infrastructure. Exam pattern. Diagnose two independent input contract violations in a vision-enabled chat request. Case study. Contoso is building a Microsoft Foundry customer support solution. Two development teams work on different use cases and require distinct access controls while sharing centralized network security, model deployments, and Azure tool integrations. The solution references separately provisioned Azure Storage and Azure AI Search resources. Customer requests can include unstructured text and product images. The text path must evaluate Azure AI content safety harm categories and block list hits. The image path uses a vision-enabled Azure OpenAI chat deployment. Architecture staff must preserve product-specific credentials, API contracts, lifecycle states, and regional constraints. Keep this shared context in mind for the next question. Question 17. For the text path in the shared case scenario, arrange the implementation steps for the documented Azure AI content safety REST workflow from resource preparation through result interpretation. Visible artifact. The command sends a hypertext transfer protocol post request to the configured endpoint content safety text analyze route with application programming interface version 2024-0901. It includes an OCP APIM subscription key header and a content type of application JavaScript object notation. The request body contains raw text, 4 harm categories named hate, sexual, self-harm, and violence, 1 block list name placeholder, block list halting enabled, and an output type of 4 severity levels. Arrange all 5 steps in the correct order. A. Retrieve the endpoint and a key from the deployed content safety resource. B. Interpret block lists. Match and the multi-label categories analysis severity values in the JSON response. C. Create a content safety resource in a supported region and ensure the caller has cognitive services user or higher on that resource. D. Using the retrieved endpoint and key, substitute both values into the API version equals 2024-0901 content safety/text analyze CURL command and complete its JSON body with the raw text, harm categories, and any block list settings. E. Send the finalized authenticated post request with the content safety subscription key header and JSON content type. Lock in your answer. Correct response, step 1. Create a content safety resource in a supported region and ensure the caller has cognitive services user or higher on that resource. Step 2. Retrieve the endpoint and a key from the deployed content safety resource. Step 3. Using the retrieved endpoint and key, substitute both values into the API version equals 2024-0901 content safety/text, analyze CURL command, and complete its JSON body with the raw text, harm categories, and any block list settings. Step 4. Send the finalized authenticated post request with the content safety subscription key header and JSON content type. Step 5. Interpret block lists. Match and the multi-label categories analysis severity values in the JSON response. Why this works. Create the content safety resource and grant sufficient resource access first. Retrieve that deployed resource's endpoint and key. Then use those values to finalize the versioned text analysis request and JSON body. Send the authenticated post only after the address, credential, and payload are complete, and interpret block list matches and category severity values only after the response returns. Exam pattern. Order the product-specific configuration, credential retrieval, dependent request finalization, submission, and response stages for content safety text analysis. Question 18. A Foundry agent service agent can call a refund tool. The safety team wants to scan proposed tool calls for a defined risk and block unsafe actions. The same named guardrail is also assigned to the underlying model. Which design statement is correct? A. Register any agent in the Foundry control plane because the same guardrail behavior applies outside Foundry agent service. B. Route the refund request through an audio model because guardrails cover audio model prompts and completions identically. C. Add the tool call control only to the model because model assignment automatically runs every agent-specific control. D. Add a tool call intervention control to the agent guardrail. Treat the agent-only intervention as preview and do not expect that control to run on the model. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Add a tool call intervention control to the agent guardrail. Treat the agent-only intervention as preview and do not expect that control to run on the model. Why this works. A guardrail control defines a risk, intervention points, and an action. Tool call and tool response intervention points are agent-only and preview. When the same guardrail is applied to a model, agent-specific controls are not run on that model. The held guardrail scope applies to Foundry agent service agents, not every agent registered in Foundry control plane, and excludes audio model prompts and completions such as Whisper. Exam pattern. Place an agent tool call safety control at the correct intervention point without overextending its runtime scope. Question 19. A team is creating an initial token build model deployment in the current Microsoft Foundry portal. Its approved change record requires the Foundry project and deployment permission prerequisites to be validated and signed off before engineers may open the model catalog or review a model card. Order the implementation steps so that supported configuration, quota allocation, and the readiness gate are handled before inference traffic is sent. Visible artifact. The deployment plan uses the current Foundry project, a selected model, a selected deployment type, and a selected region. The deployment name is contract extractor. The tokens per minute allocation is pending. The status gate reads succeeded. Arrange all 5 steps in the correct order. A. Verify that the deployment status is succeeded. B. Choose default or custom settings. Set the deployment name, allocate TPM, and create the deployment. C. Review the model card and confirm a supported deployment type, supported region, and available per region per model TPM quota. D. Send inference requests with the deployment name in the model parameter. E. Validate and record the Foundry project and cognitive services contributor or equivalent deployment permission. Lock in your answer. Correct response, step 1. Validate and record the Foundry project and cognitive services contributor or equivalent deployment permission. Step 2. Review the model card and confirm a supported deployment type, supported region, and available per region per model TPM quota. Step 3. Choose default or custom settings. Set the deployment name, allocate TPM, and create the deployment. Step 4. Verify that the deployment status is succeeded. Step 5. Send inference requests with the deployment name in the model parameter. Why this works. The approved change record makes signed-off project and deployment permission validation a prerequisite to model catalog work. After that gate, review the model card, supported deployment type and region, and per region per model TPM availability. Then choose settings, name the deployment, allocate TPM, and create it. The deployment must reach succeeded before inference uses the deployment name in the model parameter. Exam pattern. Sequence an initial token build Foundry model deployment from prerequisite validation through inference routing. Question 20. A team is migrating a version 3.0 text translation workload to the latest GA Azure Translator Text API 2026-0606. The proposed configuration selects the LLM path and sends 60 items of up to 7,000 characters each, which 3 changes are required before non-production validation. Visible artifact. The translation request uses Application Programming Interface version 2026-0606. Its model is the large language model path, and the target list contains one language code, FR. The input count is 60, and the maximum characters per item is 7,000. Select 3 answers. A. Reduce the LLM request to no more than 50 elements and no more than 5,000 characters per element. B. Run both NMT and LLM translation for every item because the 2026-0606 model choice is conjunctive. C. Retain 60 elements because the NMT limit of 1,000 elements also applies to the LLM path. D. Provide the Microsoft Foundry resource required for the selected LLM translation path. E. Replace the version 3.02 field with the 2026-0606 targets array and update dependent request and response handling. F. Budget the selected LLM path by source text characters, the same billing unit used by NMT. Lock in your answer. Correct response A. Reduce the LLM request to no more than 50 elements and no more than 5,000 characters per element. D. Provide the Microsoft Foundry resource required for the selected LLM translation path. E. Replace the version 3.02 field with the 2026-0606 targets array and update dependent request and response handling. Why this works. Translator text 2026-0606 is GA, but not backward compatible with version 3.0. Migration requires the new targets array and updates to payload, response, and method-dependent code. The LLM path requires a Microsoft Foundry resource and has path local maxima of 50 elements and 5,000 characters per element. NMT and LLM are alternatives, and LLM billing uses processed input and output tokens rather than source text characters. Exam pattern. Repair a breaking version LLM translator request by correcting schema, resource, and path local payload limits. Question 21. A team is preparing a Microsoft Foundry model deployment. The requirements are shown in the configuration artifact. Which 2 actions should the team take before rollout? Visible artifact. The deployment requirements set the inference processing boundary to the European Union data zone. The workload pattern is variable and bursty. Latency variance is acceptable, and target environment validation is pending. Select 2 answers. A. Verify that the model supports that deployment type in the target region and review deployment quota and rate limits. B. Choose developer because it provides an SLA-backed production deployment within one data zone. C. Choose global standard because a resource created in an EU region keeps all inference processing in that region. D. Choose data zone standard in an EU region as the intended deployment type. E. Choose global provisioned because variable traffic and acceptable latency variance require reserved capacity. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Verify that the model supports that deployment type in the target region, and review deployment quota and rate limits. D. Choose data zone standard in an EU region as the intended deployment type. Why this works. Data zone standard fits variable, bursty traffic billed per token, while keeping inference processing inside the named EU data zone. A nominal fit is not enough. Model support varies by deployment type and region, and availability, quota, and rate limits must be checked before rollout. Exam pattern. Translate residency and workload requirements into a deployment family, and gate the choice on target environment support. Question 22. Contoso is building a customer support solution in a current Microsoft Foundry project. Private policy documents are indexed for retrieval, and an order status API is available. The solution must ground answers in retrieved passages, call the API when order data is needed, and route refund drafts through a maker-checker loop with explicit criteria. Unapproved drafts must be revised from checker feedback and escalated after a fixed attempt limit. For this question, the policy index already exists and is listed for the project. The team must complete its integration as the agent's retrieval tool and validate the configured agent. Visible artifact, unordered integration status snapshot. Agent evaluation has not been run. The policy index exists. No project connection exists. No retrieval tool configuration exists. The operator connection permission is unverified. Support for the selected tool is unverified. Arrange all 4 steps in the order the team should perform them. A. Verify connection management permission plus the selected tool's model, region, lifecycle, authentication, and dependent service requirements. B. Test retrieval quality, response accuracy, and citations through the configured agent. C. Create the required Foundry project connection to the index or retrieval service. D. Configure the agent retrieval tool to use the project connection and policy index. Lock in your answer. Correct response. Step 1. Verify connection management permission plus the selected tools, model, region, lifecycle, authentication, and dependent service requirements. Step 2. Create the required Foundry project connection to the index or retrieval service. Step 3. Configure the agent retrieval tool to use the project connection and policy index. Step 4. Test retrieval quality, response accuracy, and citations through the configured agent. Why this works. A visible retrieval tool still requires support and access checks. After the required project connection is created, the agent can be configured to use it, and the integrated behavior must then be tested for retrieval quality, answer accuracy, and citations. Exam pattern. Order the integration of an existing private index as an agent retrieval tool, including support checks, project connection, tool configuration, and evaluation. Question 23. An application uses the responses API with a deployed reasoning model. The team has confirmed which reasoning effort values the exact model in version support. The request must control processing depth and cap returned output without sending unsupported randomness parameters. Which configuration should the team use? A. Set a supported reasoning effort value and use max output tokens for the responses API output cap. B. Set temperature and top P together, then use max tokens for the responses API output cap. C. Set a supported reasoning effort value and use max completion tokens for the responses API output cap. D. Set frequency penalty and log probs, then use max tokens to return the raw reasoning trace. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Set a supported reasoning effort value and use max output tokens for the responses API output cap. Why this works. Reasoning effort support is model and version specific. For the responses API, the documented output token parameter is max output tokens. Reasoning models do not support the listed temperature, top P, penalty, log prob, or max tokens parameters. Exam pattern. Configure a model-validated reasoning depth control and the API correct output token cap. Question 24. A team is designing a new production orchestration that coordinates hosted agents and must call Foundry-specific platform tools. The design must avoid a dependency on the public preview visual workflow surface that retires on December 1st, 2026. Which architecture should the team choose? A. Adopt the Visual Workflow Designer as the generally available default for new production workflows. B. Use Microsoft Agent Framework from code and call the Responses API through the Foundry project endpoint. C. Use only the resource-level OpenAI endpoint because it exposes Foundry-exclusive agents and platform tools. D. Insert the hosted agents directly into the Visual Workflow Designer and depend on its in-portal runtime. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Use Microsoft Agent Framework from code and call the Responses API through the Foundry project endpoint. Why this works. Agent Framework is the documented code-first orchestration layer for hosted agents and multi-agent systems, and it can use the Responses API at the Foundry project endpoint. Hosted agents are not supported in the Visual Workflow Designer. That designer is public preview and scheduled to retire on December 1st, 2026, while the resource-level OpenAI endpoint does not expose Foundry-specific agents, evaluations, or exclusive tools. Exam pattern. Choose the supported orchestration and endpoint architecture for new hosted agent workflows that need Foundry-exclusive capabilities. Question 25. A developer is integrating a Foundry new project. The application must use project-native operations and then obtain an OpenAI-compatible client. The environment and code are shown. The client fails because the package generation does not match the quick start. Which remediation preserves the required capabilities? Visible artifact. The target is a new Foundry project. The installed dependency is Azure Artificial Intelligence Projects version 1.0.0. The code imports default Azure credential from Azure Identity and Artificial Intelligence Project Client from Azure Artificial Intelligence Projects. It creates a project client with the endpoint held in the project endpoint variable and a default Azure credential, then obtains an OpenAI compatible client from that project client. A. Install both Azure AI Projects 1.x and 2.x so runtime package resolution can select the project generation automatically. B. Replace AI Project Client with only the resource-level OpenAI client and assume it exposes project-native connection and tracing operations. C. Install Azure AI Projects at least 2.0.0. Keep the Foundry project endpoint and retain the project client, then OpenAI-compatible client sequence. D. Keep Azure AI Projects equals 1.0.0 because it is stable and point the unchanged 2.x quick start at the Foundry new project. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Install Azure AI Projects at least 2.0.0, keep the Foundry project endpoint, and retain the project client, then OpenAI-compatible client sequence. Why this works. Azure AI Projects 2.x is the stable SDK generation for Foundry New, while 1.x targets Foundry Classic, and the two Quick Start generations are incompatible. The documented 2.x pattern creates AI Project Client with the project endpoint and default Azure credential, then obtains an OpenAI-compatible client from that project client. Exam pattern. Diagnose and repair a project generation mismatch while preserving both project-native and OpenAI-compatible client surfaces. You are halfway through the practice exam. Reset your attention. Keep architecture choices separate from runtime controls, and verify the exact mechanism each requirement needs. Question 26. The policy index and the model connection for Contoso's support application are operational. Complete the request time RAG path for a new policy question. Visible artifact. The request contract lists two available services. They are the policy index and the Foundry model connection. Its input is a customer policy question. Its required output is an answer grounded in policy passages. Arrange all three steps in request processing order. A. Submit the constructed prompt to produce the grounded answer. B. Search the policy index for passages relevant to the question. C. Construct a model prompt that includes the question and the passages returned for it. Lock in your answer. Correct response. Step 1. Search the policy index for passages relevant to the question. Step 2. Construct a model prompt that includes the question and the passages returned for it. Step 3. Submit the constructed prompt to produce the grounded answer. Why this works. Search must run before prompt construction because it supplies the grounding passages. Prompt construction then combines those passages with the question, and the model call consumes that completed prompt. The resulting dependency chain is search, construct, submit. Exam pattern. Reconstruct request time, RAG, dependencies from producer-consumer relationships rather than artifact field order. Question 27. On the Microsoft Foundry quota page, the scope column for a particular deployed model shows global. How is quota managed for that model? A. At the Microsoft Entra tenant level for every model. B. Separately for each Foundry project resource. C. At the subscription level for that model. D. Separately in each Azure region for that model. Lock in your answer. Correct response. C. At the subscription level for that model. Why this works. A scope value of global or data zone indicates subscription level quota management for the model. A named region in the scope column indicates per region management for the subscription and model. Exam pattern. Interpret a model-specific quota scope value before choosing a scaling action. Question 28. A team is implementing a low-latency voice agent that must listen to end-user audio, reason, speak, and call tools. Conversations can last longer than 1 hour. Which 3 design decisions satisfy the documented GPT real-time path? Select 3 answers. A. Create a real-time voice agent session with session.type set to real-time on the GA OpenAI version 1/real-time endpoint. B. Monitor expires at, renew before the 60-minute session limit, and save and restore conversation context for longer interactions. C. Call OpenAI version 1/real-time with a date-based API version query parameter to select the GA endpoint. D. Keep the original session open indefinitely because activity extends the documented 60-minute maximum. E. Use streaming transcription alone because converting audio to text automatically provides model reasoning and tool calls. F. Use a Microsoft Foundry resource in a supported region. Deploy a supported GPT real-time model and authenticate with an API key or Microsoft Entra ID. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Create a real-time voice agent session with session.type set to real-time on the GA OpenAI version 1/real-time endpoint. B. Monitor expires at, renew before the 60-minute session limit, and save and restore conversation context for longer interactions. F. Use a Microsoft Foundry resource in a supported region. Deploy a supported GPT real-time model and authenticate with an API key or Microsoft Entra ID. Why this works. The reasoning path is a real-time voice agent session that listens, reasons, speaks, and calls tools. It uses session.type real-time on the GA OpenAI version 1/real-time endpoint, requires a supported region Foundry resource, and deployed real-time model with key or Entra authentication, and has a 60-minute maximum session duration. Longer conversations require renewal plus saved and restored context. Exam pattern. Configure the supported GPT real-time reasoning path and design session continuity beyond the maximum duration. Question 29. A governance team is redesigning evidence custody for 2027. It must investigate hosted agent executions, let recipients verify the Azure origin of batch-synthesized MP4 avatar videos, and retain historical approval records from a visual Foundry workflow, while moving new approvals to a supported surface. Which plan preserves each artifact's authority? A. Use avatar manifests to reconstruct agent spans, copy trace identifiers into MP4 metadata as origin proof, and move new approvals to Microsoft Agent Framework while retaining workflow exports. B. Use application insights traces for agent investigations. Preserve each signed avatar manifest with its batch MP4. Retain workflow versions as historical records, and implement new approvals on Microsoft Agent Framework. C. Use application insights traces for agent investigations. Preserve each avatar manifest with its MP4, and continue issuing new approvals through the visual workflow, because saved versions remain unchangeable, while preserving version exports for later audit review. D. Export trace records as the approval ledger, remove avatar manifests after hashing each MP4, and convert saved workflow versions into agent execution evidence before implementing replacement approvals. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Use application insights traces for agent investigations. Preserve each signed avatar manifest with its batch MP4. Retain workflow versions as historical records, and implement new approvals on Microsoft Agent Framework. Why this works. Application Insights traces carry hosted agent execution telemetry and inherit monitoring access, retention, and sensitive data controls. The Signed Content Credentials manifest establishes Azure text-to-speech avatar origin for supported batch MP4 output. Workflow versions can remain historical records, but the visual workflow retires on December 1st, 2026. New workflow development moves to Microsoft Agent Framework. Exam pattern. Assign investigation, origin, and approval evidence correctly across retirement. Question 30. A team uses a Foundry new project and the Azure AI Projects 2.x client. The application must use Foundry-specific agents and evaluations. Azure OpenAI Endpoint currently contains the resource-level OpenAI endpoint. The client fails before it can access the required project capabilities. Review the code. What should the developer change? Visible artifact. The code imports the operating system module, default Azure credential, from Azure Identity, and Artificial Intelligence Project Client from Azure Artificial Intelligence Projects. It creates a client named Project whose endpoint comes from the environment variable named Azure OpenAI Endpoint, and whose credential is a default Azure credential. A. Keep the resource-level OpenAI endpoint and downgrade the application to the Azure AI Projects 1.x client used with Foundry Classic. B. Set endpoint to the project-scoped Foundry endpoint that includes the resource and project names, and keep the 2.x client. C. Keep the resource-level OpenAI endpoint and add a logical project connection to the same resource, so the endpoint becomes project-scoped. D. Keep the resource-level OpenAI endpoint because it exposes Foundry agents and evaluations through the full OpenAI API surface. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Set endpoint to the project-scoped Foundry endpoint that includes the resource and project names, and keep the 2.x client. Why this works. For Foundry new with Azure AI Projects 2.x, the project client must use the project-scoped endpoint. The project endpoint includes both resource and project names and provides access to Foundry-specific platform capabilities. A resource-level OpenAI endpoint is a different scope and does not provide Foundry-specific agents or evaluations. Exam pattern. Diagnose an endpoint scope defect in a Foundry new Azure AI Projects 2.x application. Question 31. A support agent will move through development, test, and production. Its behavior must be auditable as a reusable version. Returning users must resume service-managed history that includes tool activity, and each environment supplies a different MCPUL at invocation time. The same agent version must run in every environment. Which three design decisions should the team implement? Select three answers. A. Store role, goals, and constraints in the first conversation item and keep them outside the named agent definition. B. Template the MCP server URL with a required structured input whose JSON schema has type string. C. Carry the previous response output into each new request and use application storage as the cross-session interaction record. D. Bind a fixed MCP server URL to a separate agent version per environment while sharing conversation identifiers across versions. E. Store the model and behavior instructions in a named versioned agent definition used by every environment. F. Use a durable conversation object to retain messages, tool calls, and tool outputs for returning users. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Template the MCP server URL with a required structured input whose JSON schema has type string. E. Store the model and behavior instructions in a named versioned agent definition used by every environment. F. Use a durable conversation object to retain messages, tool calls, and tool outputs for returning users. Why this works. The reusable model and instructions belong in a named versioned agent definition. A conversation is the durable service object that stores messages, tool calls, tool outputs, and other items across sessions. A structured input can override the MCP server URL at invocation time, making it required with a string schema, validates that runtime value, and avoids creating environment-specific agent versions. Previous response chaining is a valid context technique, but it is not the requested service-managed conversation record. Exam pattern. Separate reusable definition state, service-managed interaction state, and environment-specific runtime tool configuration. Question 32. A web app currently authenticates to a Microsoft Foundry resource with an API key. Its system-assigned managed identity is enabled, and a user access administrator is preparing a zero-outage keyless migration. Before the application team changes the client authentication code, which action should the administrator take? A. Attach a new user-assigned identity to the caller, but leave both workload identities without a Foundry role. B. Change the caller to default Azure credential and begin token requests before assigning any Foundry role. C. Assign the Foundry data plane role to the deployment operator who already manages resource access. D. Assign the required Foundry role to the caller's system-assigned identity at the resource scope. E. Disable local authentication on the Foundry resource and then test the existing caller during the window. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Assign the required Foundry role to the caller's system-assigned identity at the resource scope. Why this works. Authorize the runtime principal first by assigning the app's managed identity an applicable role on the Foundry resource. The application can then move to Microsoft Entra tokens. Key authentication is removed only after all callers use token authentication. Exam pattern. Choose the prerequisite authorization action for a zero-outage keyless migration. Question 33. An Azure AI Search indexer has max failed items set above 0. Its latest invocation reports success, but users cannot retrieve several expected documents. You need to identify the affected documents and determine whether non-fatal conditions contributed. What should you inspect first? A. Only the process document metric, because a volume count proves every document was enriched and made retrievable. B. The Azure activity log entry for admin key use, because it contains the details of each underlying indexing call. C. Only the top-level indexer status, because running proves that the latest invocation is executing correctly. D, the invocation's execution details, including document-specific errors, warnings, and failed document keys when available. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D, the invocation as execution details, including document-specific errors, warnings, and failed document keys when available. Why this works. A run can report success even when individual documents fail, provided the error count remains below max failed items. Execution details expose run errors, warnings, and document-specific problems. This number tolerated failures can include a document key when available. Warnings do not stop indexing, but can still indicate unexpected outcomes. Exam pattern. Diagnose missing content after a threshold-tolerated successful indexer run. Question 34. A deployed Microsoft Foundry application has stable latency and request volume, but the team suspects that response quality is drifting. They maintain a fixed test dataset and need a repeatable post-production mechanism specifically identified for drift detection. What should they configure? A. Scheduled quality and safety evaluation that runs the maintained test dataset. B. Sampled continuous evaluation of production traffic only, with no scheduled test dataset evaluation. C. Scheduled red teaming only, because adversarial probes are the documented test dataset drift mechanism. D. Operational metrics only, because stable latency and volume establish that response quality has not drifted. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Scheduled quality and safety evaluation that runs the maintained test dataset. Why this works. The packet distinguishes post-production monitoring layers. It identifies scheduled quality and safety evaluation using test datasets as the mechanism for detecting system drift. Operational metrics, sampled continuous evaluation of production traffic, and scheduled red teaming serve different monitoring purposes. Exam pattern. Select the correct post-production monitoring layer for test dataset drift detection. Question 35. A classic RAG application already pre-processes its documents outside Azure AI Search. New and changed documents must be available in the index every 2 minutes. The team must retain the existing pre-processing path. Which ingestion design should they use? A. Keep an indexer on its most frequent recurring schedule and add an OCR skill to reduce the interval. B. Replace classic RAG with the preview agentic retrieval knowledge source pipeline solely to obtain the 2-minute update interval. C. Configure an Azure AI Search indexer with a recurring 2-minute schedule. D. Push the pre-processed content to the search index by using the push API. Lock in your answer. Correct response. D. Push the pre-processed content to the search index by using the push API. Why this works. Azure AI Search indexers can run on demand or on a recurring schedule as often as every 5 minutes. The packet states that updates more frequent than every 5 minutes require a push model, and classic RAG supports the push API for pre-processed content. Exam pattern. Choose pull versus push ingestion when classic RAG needs updates more frequently than the indexer's schedule boundary. Question 36. An Azure AI Search enrichment pipeline receives supported Office documents and PDFs. The index must preserve detected document structure as Markdown section objects. The team wants a built-in skill and does not want to host external custom code. Which skill set design should they choose? A. Use a custom skill that executes inside the Azure AI Search service without an external web interface. B. Use document intelligence layout skill with file data input, Markdown output format, and Markdown document output. C. Use a built-in entity recognition skill and map its entity collection to detected layout sections. D. Use an OCR image skill and treat its plain recognized text as the documented Markdown section collection. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Use document intelligence layout skill with file data input, markdown output format, and markdown document output. Why this works. The document layout skill uses the Azure Document Intelligence Layout model to detect document structure and can produce markdown. A skill set definition can provide file data to document intelligence layout skill and map markdown document output with markdown output. Markdown document is a collection of section objects. Exam pattern. Configure built-in structural enrichment for markdown section output. Question 37. An application uses the latest GA Azure OpenAI API v1 and a supported GPT-4o version 2024-08-06 deployment to extract incident records. The current request returns valid JSON, but required fields are sometimes missing or have the wrong types. Review the code. Which change best enforces the domain extraction contract? Visible artifact. The request calls the chat completions creation operation on the client. It selects the model from the environment variable named Azure OpenAI deployment, passes the messages collection, requests a JavaScript object notation object response format, and disables parallel tool calls. A. Replace the extraction request with translator adaptive reference pairs, because that mechanism enforces JSON field types. B. Keep JSON mode and set parallel tool calls to true, so parallel strict function calls enforce every required field. C. Move the request to a bring your own data scenario, because structured outputs are supported there for strict schemas. D. Replace JSON mode with structured outputs that supply the incident JSON schema and a task-specific extraction instruction. Lock in your answer. Correct response. D. Replace JSON mode with structured outputs that supply the incident JSON schema and a task-specific extraction instruction. Why this works. JSON mode guarantees valid JSON, but not strict adherence to a supplied schema. Azure OpenAI structured outputs constrain a supported model to a JSON schema for typed extraction, and the held example combines a task-specific instruction with a typed schema. The latest GA v1 API supports structured outputs for the listed supported model version. Exam pattern. Interpret why valid JSON fails a types domain contract and select the strict schema mechanism. Question 38. An architecture team is connecting Azure AI Search retrieval paths to Logic Apps workflows and a Foundry agent. Match each implementation requirement to the supported configuration. Requirements. 1. Use the preview Azure AI Search import data wizard and identify the hosting plan it generates for the workflow. 2. From an existing Logic Apps standard workflow, use multiple authentication types and direct access to Azure Virtual Network resources. 3. From a Logic Apps consumption workflow, use the managed Azure-hosted Azure AI Search connector and its documented authentication method. 4. Give a Foundry agent direct access to one Azure AI Search index through the Azure AI Search agent tool. Available targets. A. An Azure AI Search tool configuration that supplies project connection ID and index name. B. The managed Azure-hosted Azure AI Search connector authenticated with an API key. C. A consumption Logic Apps workflow created by the import data wizard. D. A standard Logic Apps workflow created by the import data wizard using the managed connector as if it shared the built-in connector's network contract. E. The built-in service provider Azure AI Search connector with its supported authentication choices and virtual network access. Lock in your answer. Correct response. 1. Use the preview Azure AI Search import data wizard and identify the hosting plan it generates for the workflow. Matches a consumption Logic Apps workflow created by the import data wizard. 2. From an existing Logic Apps standard workflow, use multiple authentication types and direct access to Azure Virtual Network resources. Matches the built-in service provider Azure AI Search connector with its supported authentication choices and virtual network access. 3. From a Logic App's consumption workflow, use the managed Azure-hosted Azure AI Search connector and its documented authentication method. Matches the managed Azure-hosted Azure AI Search connector authenticated with an API key. 4. Give a Foundry agent direct access to one Azure AI Search index through the Azure AI Search agent tool. Matches an Azure AI Search tool configuration that supplies project connection ID and index name. Why this works. The Preview Import Data Wizard creates a consumption Logic Apps workflow. Logic Apps Standard uses the built-in service provider connector, which supports multiple authentication types and direct access to virtual network resources. Logic Apps Consumption uses the managed Azure-hosted connector, which requires an API key. A Foundry Azure AI Search agent tool requires both project connection ID and index name. Exam pattern. Differentiate direct workflow and agent tool connection contracts across hosting models. Question 39. A Foundry agent connects to a remote MCP server that exposes read ticket, close ticket, and delete ticket. Downstream identity and RBAC are already configured correctly. The agent must access read ticket without approval, access close ticket only after human approval, and never be offered delete ticket. Which MCP tool configuration meets the requirements? A. Allow all three tools and rely on an input/output content guardrail to deny delete ticket as a replacement for tool access control. B. Allow only read ticket and close ticket. Set require approval to never for every allowed tool. C. Allow only read ticket and close ticket. Set named approval lists to never for read ticket and always for close ticket. D. Omit allowed tools. Set approval to always for close ticket and never for read ticket. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Allow only read ticket and close ticket. Set named approval lists to never for read ticket and always for close ticket. Why this works. For a remote MCP tool, allowed tools restricts which server tools the agent can access. Omitting it exposes every tool from the server. Require approval can apply always or never policies to named tools. These controls are separate from downstream token audience and RBAC authorization, which the scenario states are already configured. Exam pattern. Configure least exposure MCP tool access and per tool human approval without conflating downstream authorization. Question 40. A team is implementing 3 multi-agent workflows with Microsoft Agent Framework. Match each coordination requirement to the pattern that provides the required control flow. Requirements. 1. A triage agent begins each case. From the customer's message, it turns the ongoing case over to either billing or technical support, and the receiving specialist assumes responsibility. 2. A researcher produces evidence notes. An analyst uses those notes to draft a recommendation, and a reviewer checks that draft before delivery. 3. Security, legal, and operations each assess the same change request independently. Their assessments are collected before a separate synthesis step. Available targets. A. Handoff orchestration. B. Concurrent orchestration. C. Sequential orchestration. Lock in your answer. Correct response. 1. A triage agent begins each case. From the customer's message, it turns the ongoing case over to either billing or technical support, and the receiving specialist assumes responsibility. Matches handoff orchestration. 2. A researcher produces evidence notes, an analyst uses those notes to draft a recommendation, and a reviewer checks that draft before delivery. Matches sequential orchestration. 3. Security, legal, and operations each assess the same change request independently. Their assessments are collected before a separate synthesis step. Matches concurrent orchestration. Why this works. Handoff fits the support case because an agent transfers the conversation and task ownership to another specialist, according to context, with no central authority retaining control. Sequential fits the research review chain because each stage consumes the preceding stage's work. Concurrent fits the change assessment because several agents process the same input independently, and their results are collected. Exam pattern. Differentiate three current orchestration topologies by data dependency, independence, and transfer of control. Question 41. A media team has pre-recorded interviews and needs German text translations. The team accepts preview features and will work only in the new Microsoft Foundry portal. Which implementation matches the held LLM speech translation contract? A. Stream the recordings through standalone real-time speech translation and treat that request as the LLM speech pre-recorded audio API contract. B. Use default fast transcription with API version 2025-10-15, set task to translate, and derive the target language from the audio metadata. C. Post multi-part audio to transcriptions, transcribe with API version 2025-10-15, enable enhanced mode, set task to translate, and provide the German target language code. D. Send the audio to Azure Translator Text from the Foundry Classic portal and request a German transcription response. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Post multi-part audio to transcriptions, transcribe with API version 2025-10-15, enable enhanced mode, set task to translate, and provide the German target language code. Why this works. Preview LLM speech translates pre-recorded audio to text through the multi-part transcriptions transcribe request. The held contract uses API version 2025-10-15 with enhanced mode enabled, task set to translate, and an explicit supported target language. This is not default fast transcription, Azure Translator Text, or the standalone real-time speech translation API. And the Playground workflow is not available in the Classic portal. Exam pattern. Select the correct product local request for translating pre-recorded speech into target language text. Question 42. An engineering team is implementing image description extraction with Azure Content Understanding. The archived evidence was retrieved on July 25, 2026. Match each implementation concern to the required action or boundary. Requirements. 1. Resource and model readiness before analyzer requests. 2. Request that starts image description analysis. 3. Handling the initial asynchronous response. 4. A PI version for new production code in the held archive. Available targets. A. Use a supported region Foundry resource, sufficient creation role, and configured default model deployments. B. Target 2025-11-01 GA, the 2024-12-01 preview, and 2025-05-01 preview APIs had passed their July 15, 2026 retirement deadline. C. Post a URL input to pre-built image search. Analyze with API version 2025-11-01 and the subscription key. D. Follow operation location and poll every 1 to 2 seconds until status is succeeded. Lock in your answer. Correct response, 1. Resource and model readiness before analyzer requests. Matches use a supported region Foundry resource, sufficient creation role, and configured default model deployments. 2. Request that starts image description analysis. Matches post a URL input to pre-built image search. Analyze with API version 2025-11-01 and the subscription key. 3. Handling the initial asynchronous response. Matches follow operation location and poll every 1 to 2 seconds until status is succeeded. 4. API version for new production code in the held archive. Matches target 2025-11-01 GA. The 2024-12-01 preview and 2025-05-01 preview AP had passed their July 15th, 2026 retirement deadline. Why this works? The GA Image Analyzer path requires the supported region resource and configured defaults. Starts with the held 2025-11-01 pre-built image search analyze request and returns 202 accepted with an operation location to poll until succeeded. In the July 25th, 2026 archive, both older preview API versions had passed their July 15th, 2026 retirement deadline, so they are not the target for new production code. Exam pattern. Assemble the prerequisite, request, asynchronous result, and lifecycle layers of the GA Image Analyzer path. Question 43. A claims team needs a supported visual low-code process. It must apply an exact threshold, call a Foundry agent to draft an assessment, pause for human approval, and update the claim system through a connector. Which architecture best meets the requirements? A. Use direct agent-to-agent handoff and encode the threshold and approval only in prompts. B. Create the production process in the Preview Foundry Visual Workflow Designer and depend on it beyond December 1st, 2026. C. Use Azure Logic Apps for conditions, approval, and connectors, and call a Foundry agent from the AI step. D. Use Model Router as the engine for policy conditions, approval, and the connector call. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Use Azure Logic Apps for conditions, approval, and connectors, and call a Foundry agent from the AI step. Why this works? Logic Apps is the documented visual low-code option for deterministic steps plus AI reasoning. It can own conditions, approvals, APIs, and connectors while calling a Foundry agent. Model Router only selects an underlying model, and the Preview Foundry Workflow Designer retires December 1st, 2026. Exam pattern. Choose a visual control plane for deterministic gates, approval, connectors, and AI. Question 44. A team is reviewing a conceptual Azure AI Search RAG ingestion configuration for PDFs that contain scanned pages. Match each labeled configuration stage to its role in the ingestion flow. Visible artifact. The configuration has 4 labeled stages. Stage CFGA reads the source portable document format file and produces document content plus normalized images. Stage CFGB reads the normalized images and produces text for each normalized image. Stage CFGC reads document content and produces passages plus a vector for each passage. Stage CFGD reads each passage vector and writes it to the content vector destination field. Requirements: 1. CFGA 2. CFGB 3. CFGC 4. CFGD. Available targets: A. Subdivide content and generate vector representations. B. Apply OCR to images produced by document cracking. C. Write skill outputs into destination index fields. D. Extract text and images from each source document. Lock in your answer. Correct response: 1. CFGA matches extract text and images from each source document. 2. CFGB matches apply OCR to images produced by document cracking. 3. CFGC matches subdivide content and generate vector representations. 4. CFGD matches write skill outputs into destination index fields. Why this works? Document cracking extracts source text and images. A skill set can then OCR the cracked images, chunk content, and generate vectors. Skill outputs are mapped into fields in the destination search index. Together, these stages include both document handling and OCR for scanned content without moving OCR to query time. Exam pattern. Interpret a conceptual RAG ingestion configuration and map each stage to its supported behavior. Question 45. A Foundry agent service team is piloting preview agent guardrails. The underlying model guardrail scans every available stage, but the agent is assigned the configuration shown. Security testing finds that unsafe tool arguments and unsafe tool responses are not intercepted. Which configuration defect explains the result? Visible artifact. The assigned agent guardrail scans user input and final output. Its tool call and tool response intervention points are omitted. The underlying model guardrail scans user input, tool calls, tool responses, and final output. A. Tool payloads are scanned only by adding a human approval workflow. Guardrail intervention points do not apply to tools. B. The model guardrail and agent guardrail are always additive, so the test must be failing because final output scanning is disabled. C. Scanning user input automatically covers tool arguments, while scanning final output automatically covers tool responses. D. The assigned agent guardrail can fully override the model guardrail, so the omitted preview tool call and tool response points remain unscanned. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. The assigned agent guardrail can fully override the model guardrail, so the omitted preview tool call and tool response points remain unscanned. Why this works. An assigned agent guardrail can fully override the underlying model guardrail. Tool call and tool response scanning are separate agent-only preview intervention points, so omitting them can leave those stages unscanned, even when user input and final output are scanned. Exam pattern. Diagnose an effective guardrail coverage gap from a concrete agent configuration. Question 46. An insurance application sends an uploaded accident image and the prompt shown to a vision-enabled chat model. Which response behavior should the application expect and preserve? Visible artifact. The request uses a vision-enabled chat deployment. It sends an image input sourced from the uploaded accident photo joint photographic experts group file. It also sends a text input asking the model to assess the visible damage in this image for the insurer claim file. A. Describe the visible damage and distinguish those observations from any cause that the image does not establish. B. Describe the visible damage, infer the most likely collision cause, and report that cause as established by the image. C. Describe the visible damage and state that this image response proves the same deployment can answer questions grounded in accident video. D. Return only the file name and MIME type because vision-enabled chat cannot answer questions about uploaded image content. Lock in your answer. Correct response, A. Describe the visible damage and distinguish those observations from any cause that the image does not establish. Why this works. Vision-enabled chat models can answer general questions about uploaded images. For this follow-up, the answer should remain factual and descriptive, grounded in visible details, and should not promote plausible speculation about the accident cause into fact. Exam pattern. Evaluate the supported behavior and evidentiary boundary of a direct image-grounded chat request. Question 47. An architecture team is selecting Microsoft Foundry services and agent tools for 4 independent workloads. Match each workload to the best fit mechanism from the archived guidance. Requirements. 1. Ground an application on private policy content that changes frequently. 2. Ground an agent on uploaded proprietary documents through a built-in vector search tool. 3. Connect an agent to an external HTTP API that has an OpenAPI 3.1 specification. 4. Extract user-defined structured fields from a document type for which no pre-built document intelligence model fits. Available targets. A. Retrieval Augmented Generation, RAGB. OpenAPI Tool, C. Fine-tuning, D. File search, E. Azure Content Understanding. Lock in your answer. Correct response. 1. Ground an application on private policy content that changes frequently. Matches retrieval augmented generation, RAG. 2. Ground an agent on uploaded proprietary documents through a built-in vector search tool. Matches file search. 3. Connect an agent to an external HTTP API that has an OpenAPI 3.1 specification. Matches OpenAPI tool. 4. Extract user-defined structured fields from a document type for which no pre-built document intelligence model fits. Matches Azure Content Understanding. Why this works. RAG fits private or frequently changing knowledge. File search is the built-in vector search choice for uploaded or proprietary files used by an agent. The OpenAPI tool connects to an external HTTP API described by OpenAPI 3.0 or 3.1. Azure Content Understanding fits schema-defined document extraction when no pre-built document intelligence model fits. Fine-tuning changes behavior, style, or task performance rather than adding fresh knowledge. Exam pattern. Choose among same-layer Foundry grounding, agent tool, API integration, extraction, and fine-tuning mechanisms. Question 48. A company must reject images that exceed configured harm severity thresholds and also detect images similar to a company-defined harmful incident. The content safety resource is in a supported region, and the company can use the preview custom feature only where it is available. Which 3 implementation decisions satisfy the supported visual policy scope? Select 3 answers. A. Configure allowed and prohibited severity levels by harm category and use the resulting accepted or rejected disposition. B. Call image, analyze with API version 2024-09-01 and submit exactly one base64 image or one blob URL. C. For the company-defined incident, use custom categories rapid only in select regions, create it, add examples, deploy it, and invoke detection with API version 2024-02-15 preview. D. Treat the base harm category result as proof that content safety applied a visible watermark and enforced the company brand guide. E. Create the custom incident with API version 2024-09-01 and use it immediately, because creation alone deploys a GA detector in every region. F. Submit both base64 content and a blob URL in one image. Analyze request so the service can reconcile the 2 copies. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Configure allowed and prohibited severity levels by harm category and use the resulting accepted or rejected disposition. B. Call image. Analyze with API version 2024-09-01 and submit exactly one base64 image or one blob URL. C. For the company-defined incident, use custom categories, rapid only in select regions. Create it, add examples, deploy it, and invoke detection with API version 2024-02-15 preview. Why this works. Base image moderation uses image, analyze 2024-09-01 with exactly one permitted image representation, and can enforce configured harm category severity thresholds through accepted or rejected. Custom Categories Rapid is a separate preview. Select region path using 2024-02-15 preview. The incident must be populated with examples, deployed, and then invoked for detection. Neither path establishes watermark application or brand rule enforcement. Exam pattern. Combine supported base harm moderation with the separate custom incident detection path while preserving API and lifecycle boundaries. Question 49. A custom agent is onboarded to a Foundry project, but the team has not added telemetry instrumentation. The team opens the Preview Metric view in the Foundry Monitor tab and sees no agent metrics or sampled continuous evaluation. What should the team do first? A. Replace telemetry collection with a distributed trace because traces and evaluator scores are interchangeable outputs. B. Open the monitoring dashboard repeatedly until it creates the missing telemetry instrumentation for the agent. C. Instrument the agent with OpenTelemetry generative AI semantic conventions and send telemetry to the project application insights instance. D. Run cluster-based error analysis before collecting evaluation results or execution telemetry. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Instrument the agent with OpenTelemetry generative AI semantic conventions and send telemetry to the project application insights instance. Why this works. For a custom agent, onboarding alone is insufficient. The agent must be instrumented to OpenTelemetry generative AI semantic conventions and send telemetry to the project application insights instance before Foundry can display metrics and enable continuous evaluation. Monitoring, evaluation, tracing, and error analysis remain separate capabilities. Exam pattern. Diagnose why an onboarded custom agent has no monitoring data and identify the first operational remediation. Question 50. A parts support application uses an Azure AI Search index. Users search both exact stock keeping unit SKU codes and natural language descriptions that often share no keywords with the index text. The application must issue one search request and combine precise text matches with conceptually similar matches. Which retrieval design should you choose? A. Use keyword search only because exact SKU matching is one requirement. B. Use semantic ranking as the standalone first-stage retrieval method. C. Use vector search only and remove the searchable text fields from the request. D. Use classic hybrid search to run full text and vector queries in parallel and merge the results with reciprocal rank fusion. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Use classic hybrid search to run full text and vector queries in parallel and merge the results with reciprocal rank fusion. Why this works. Classic hybrid search is the appropriate design because a single request can run full text and vector queries in parallel and merge their results with reciprocal rank fusion. Full text retrieval supports exact identifiers, while vector retrieval supports conceptual similarity. Semantic ranking can optionally re-rank eligible textual results, but it is not a standalone first-stage retrieval method. Exam pattern. Select an Azure AI Search retrieval pattern for a workload that simultaneously requires exact identifiers and conceptual similarity in one request. You completed AI-103 practice exam, integrated apps and agent scenarios. Review the mechanisms you missed, revisit the official documentation where needed, and use the next set to strengthen your exam-ready judgment. Thank you for practicing with WebLizard CertLab. Continue with AI-103 practice exam. Plan and manage Azure AI solutions.